Halo, Auren.
Halo, selamat sore.
Selamat sore dari Semarang.
Iya.
Berarti di sana pukul berapa, Lauren?
Di
Jam.
sini jam 4 pagi. Jadi-
Kami mohon maaf
Oh,
untuk
nggak
pendengar
apa-apa.
Auren ya.
Nggak
Kita.
apa-apa, aku sudah terbiasa sebenarnya. Aku sudah
Oh,
terbiasa dengan
gitu.
itu, ya. Dan ya, tapi saya mau minta maaf karena kalau saya lupa sesuatu atau kalau kalau
Oh
ada
ya,
sesuatu yang kurang jelas, ada kopi di sini, jadi mudah-mudahan nggak begitu.
selama ada kopi aman.
Iya, ya, aman.
Kita mungkin akan memulai dalam beberapa menit. Seperti biasa, Lauren. Akan mundur ya.
Sip.
Mohon maklum.
Oke, ini Pak, bukan belum sore ini Pak. Sore masih tidak lebih sebentar lagi ya.
Malam, Mas Dada.
Hah? Ah, mana Pak? Pak menyapa saja. Pak bicara.
Selamat siang, Pak Dekan, Pak Alam.
Selamat siang Pak Sur, Bu Laura dan Bapak Ibu semua.
Selamat siang.
Sehat, Pak Alam.
Amin,
Selamat
sehat,
malam,
sehat.
Ibu Lauren. Oh, subuh.
Sore, ya.
Jam berapa di sana?
Jam 4 pagi, Pak.
Jam 4 pagi. Masya
Iya.
Ya,
Allah.
ya, selamat pagi Bu Lauren.
Nggak apa-apa, saya sudah terbiasa dengan perbedaan waktu ya.
Halo Lauren, apa kabar?
Bagus. Apa kabar?
Baik, baik.
Bu Yani,
Bu Yaning, halo, apa kabar Bu Yaning?
Selamat siang,
Selamat
Selamat
siang.
siang.
selamat pagi waktu di
Pagi.
sini. Super pagi.
Malam, pagi, nggak tahu. Maaf, sebenarnya di sini lebih panas daripada Semarang sekarang. Panas banget. Jadi, maaf. Dan AC-nya nggak cukup dalam office saya.
rumah. Ayo, Bu, kamu bisa. Dia mencari mulut. Kamu tuh teman apa? Bukan apa dong, teman. Oh, udah kamu. Udah.
Halo, Mas Umam.
Halo Lauren.
Iya, iya. Masukin aja. Sudah
Halo, apa kabar?
Ya, ya. Oh, baik.
Hello everyone, welcome to Summer Course Program 2024, Summer Course by Master of Literature, Faculty of Humanities, Diponegoro University, Indonesia, one of the leading public universities in Indonesia. My name is Akmal, and my partner Hori is your master of ceremony for today's meeting. Today's program will be consist of three sessions: an opening remark, of course, a course overview, and the course summer course session with the topic cross-cultural understanding.
Okay, Akmal. Next, I will read for you guys about the rules in the sessions. You can see on the screens. Number one, please change your virtual backgrounds with summer course virtual backgrounds that already shared in your WhatsApp group. Number two, write down your name with the format name underscore origin. For the example is Husnul underscore Indonesia, Husnul for your name, and Indonesia is for your country. Also, for number three, participants must dress politely and behave during the course. Number four, all participants must turn off the loudspeaker or microphone during the event except when they are invited to speak by MC or moderator. Number five, all participants are required to fill in attendance that we have shared in the chat column. Number six, participants can ask questions in the chat column with the format name underscore origin underscore question context, or you can raise your hand.
Okay. Summer Course Program 2024 by Magister of Literature has brought together international students and scholars from more than 50 participants from 9 countries across the world, such as Pakistan, South Korea, Yemen, India, Vietnam, and many more. We thank you for your interest in participating in this event. And this event will take 1 week from now on until Saturday, every 3 p.m. in Jakarta time, Indonesia. I'm sure you will get a lot of fun and useful things in this summer course program. So don't miss your opportunity and make sure every moment and every second is precious.
Okay, in this rundown for today, day one, all you can see on the screens, guys. We will start at 3 until 6 p.m. with our speaker, Lauren Yap, PhD from Brown University, for our speakers today. So before we get into the sessions, I would like to invite you to listen or join us to singing the national anthem of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya song by W.R. Supratman.
Thank you very much, everyone. Now let's start our first session. Remarks from the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Diponegoro University, Professor Dr. Alamsa M.Hum. To Professor Dr. Alamsa M.Hum, time and screen are now given.
Ya, oke, oke, thank you, Mas Akmal and Mbak Khoridatun Nayiroh. Selamat sore. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, selamat sore waktu Indonesia. Excellencies, the honorable speakers, Ibu atau Mbak Lauren Zap, PhD from Brown University. Thank you for joining us. Professor Koh Jong Hun, PhD from Hankook University of Foreign Studies. Good afternoon. Thank you. Mas Rifka Pratama, SSMA from Universitas Diponegoro. Ibu Dr. Sukarni Suryaningsih MHum from Universitas Diponegoro. Terima kasih. Thank you, Bu Sukarni.
My most welcome.
And then Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra MHum from Universitas Diponegoro. Ari Dulaksono SSM Hum from Universitas Diponegoro. The head of the Master of Literature, Bapak Dr. Suryadi. Thank you, Pak Suryadi. And then the head of the committee, Ibu Dr. Ken Widyawati. And distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our summer course program, Cross-Culture Understanding. I am thrilled to have you all here for what I am sure will be a rewarding and enlightening journey. This course is designed to immerse you in the richness of global culture, promote empathy, and enhance your ability to navigate and appreciate the diversity of our world. Over the coming days, from 5 to 10 August, we will delve into various cultural practice, values, and perspective, exploring how they shape our interaction and understanding. Our aim is to foster a deeper appreciation of cultural differences while highlighting the common thread that connect us all. I encourage you to engage actively, ask questions, and share your own insight and experiences. Together, we will build a more interconnected and empathic global community. For your information, 50 participants have registered for this event, coming from 9 countries: Indonesia, Pakistan, South Korea, Yemen, India, Vietnam, China, Pantai Gading, and Malaysia. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to a fantastic and transformative learning experience with each of you. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam
Waalaikumsalam
warahmatullahi
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Alamsah MHum, for your warm opening remarks.
Okay, before we are going to the next agenda, we will introduce to you about who our speaker for Summer Course Program 2024, Magister of Literatures.
Okay, for the first speakers is Lauren Yap, PhD from Brown University. For the second speaker is Professor Koh Yong Hun, PhD from Hankook University of Foreign Studies. The third speaker is Rifka Pratama, SSMA. The fourth speaker is Dr. Sukarni Suryaningsih MHum. The fifth speaker is Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra MHum. And the last speaker is Mr. Ari Dulaksono, SSMU.
Okay, Akmal, thank you. After you have gotten to know who's our speaker in this course, so I will introduce to you also who our PIC for committed this program. Yes, there is Dr. Ken Widyawati MHum. And also, so guys, before we going through to the next agenda, we invite you all to take a picture together. So all of you can open your camera now, please.
Okay, please open your camera.
So, okay. Siapa yang mau?
Okay,
Korean.
ready?
Are you ready?
Okay, I will count it. 1, 2, 3.
Again.
1, 2, 3. Okay, maybe for the last pictures, we will take again. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Okay, we will shortly begin our core sessions, which will be brought to you with Mr. Didit for our today's moderator. But before we hand our session to him, let us to read his short curriculum vintage first. Okay, here's Mr. Yuniardi Fadila, or usually we calling by Mas Didit. He is Indonesian literature lecturer of Diponegoro University, and also he graduated from Gajah Mada University, and he has a soft publication in sociology of literature, trauma studies, and also contemporary Indonesian literatures. Wow. Halo Mas Didit.
Halo,
Halo.
Lori.
How are you, Mas?
I'm great for today. Thank you. How about you?
Okay, I'm good. Thank you. I saw you have very excited to guide our sessions today. Is it right?
Of course, I'm so sad
Okay.
for today.
Okay, Mas Didit. No need any further ado. I will catch the session for you. And for Mas Didit, the screen is yours, Mas.
Okay, thank you for Mbak Kori and Mas Akmal for presenting me. But let me introduce myself formally to all participants today. My name is Didit. Actually, my name is Junior Dipadita, but you can call me Didit or Mas Didit and whatever. And today I'm the moderator of this session with our first speaker, Dr. Lauren Yap. But hello, Dr. Lauren Yap.
Hello.
Halo. Bagaimana kabarnya?
Ya, baik, baik sekali ya. Saya senang sekali dihadir di sini sama kalian semua.
Si Dr. Lauren. So for participant known in Dr. Lauren Yap place, now it's about 4 a.m. So we must appreciate her. But first, let me read about her curriculum today. So Dr. Lauren Yap is an Harvard University graduate for her Bachelor of Art for History in field of history, and then she gained her Master of Philosophy in University of Cambridge for archaeological field, and then received her Master of Art in Anthropology in Stanford University, and lastly, she received her Doctor of Philosophy in Stanford University for anthropology. And for that Zoom, I would like to say that I have this nervousness because I'm so glad to share the screen with you, Dr. Lauren Yap, and you can hear from my broken voice. And then first and mostly role for Dr. Lauren Yap is a lecturer and researcher. She is a director of undergraduate studies and lecturer in Brown University for until today, and also a researcher with specialization in themes such as cities and urban, colonial and post-history, urban development, culture, heritage, memory, politics, and public, and etc. So many fields that Dr. Lauren Yap known so well about. So proud. And Dr. Lauren Yap also actively published articles for this last 10 years and more, I think. And besides, Dr. Lauren Yap also an editor and peer reviewer for several academic journals. So without further ado, I would like to invite Lauren to share her presentation with us. Dr. Lauren, the screen is yours.
Yes. Terima kasih. Thank you, Mas Didit. First, I want to say good afternoon to everyone. And thank you to Undip and the Fakultas Ilmu Budaya for inviting me to take part in this class today. What I hope to present will likely be nothing new to a lot of the Indonesians professors here today. So mohon maaf kalau ada kesalahan atau kekurangan. But my understanding is that many of the students, many of you who are coming from all different parts of Asia to take this course, many of you are learning about Indonesian culture and history, possibly for the first time. So I thought that today I would approach this talk and approach this topic of cross-cultural understanding from a more sort of broader and more fundamental perspective than I might usually do. I'm going to give this talk in English because I know that some students are, at different points in their familiarity with Bahasa Indonesia. But if there is anything unclear or confusing, I'm very happy to shift to Indonesian. I'm also very happy to explain my English. Sometimes I talk too fast, I get excited, and so please raise your hand or pop in the chat if you need me to repeat something or explain something a little more. And for the students also, I know that Zoom is not always the easiest way to get to know each other. I wish that we were all together in a classroom in person. But because we can't, I would love it if you could take a moment in the next next minute or so to just pop in the chat where you are right now, just the country and maybe even the city or the town where you are right now. And if you feel comfortable sharing, just kind of pop in the chat, what are some of the reasons why you wanted to take this course, right? Why are you interested in Indonesia? Why are you interested in this topic of cross-cultural understanding? Just so we can get a sense of who is here and what we're trying to achieve together. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. One second, let me get these slides up. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I'm trying this new feature that Zoom has where my face can kind of hover at the bottom of the screen. Can people see me on the slide? Okay. It's the first time I'm using this feature. So the talk that I've put together today, Cross-Cultural Understanding, a Historical Perspective from Within and Beyond Indonesia. And just a little bit about me. Mas Didit already gave a very flattering, very generous introduction. So I work as a lecturer in the Urban Studies program at Brown, which is a university in Rhode Island in the United States. It is the smallest state in the United States, so it takes me about 5 minutes to drive to the next state. And I have a very interdisciplinary academic background. So I started out in history, then moved to archaeology, and then finished up my PhD in anthropology. So I know this is not very typical in Indonesia to switch between these different fields, but I found it's been quite, gives me an interesting perspective, I hope, on some of the issues that we'll talk about today. And I've been conducting, in terms of my own research, I've been conducting ethnographic research in Indonesia, mainly in Semarang, where Undip is located, since 2012, on and off. And my work focuses on this intersection of what we might call memory politics, urban development, and community activism. And I think more broadly, you could say I'm interested in how we think about cultural heritage and how we treat cultural heritage and how that is shaped by history and politics, right? And a lot of my work specifically, a lot of the things that I've published about have been very much focused on this phenomenon in Indonesia and also happening across Asia. So you might be familiar with this in your own country. But there are many in Indonesia in the last 10 years, 15 years, there's been many Dutch era districts like Kota Lama, the old town of Semarang, that are being revitalized as heritage sites. And as a researcher, I'm interested in what that has to say about Indonesia's relationship to its colonial past. And also, as someone who's interested in cities, I'm interested in what impact that kind of gentrification has on people who actually live and work around some of these historic districts. But I'm not going to talk about that today. If you're interested in that kind of urban aspect, I'm very happy to chat with you until you are sick of me. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. The other thing I wanted to just briefly say is that a little personal note. So I'm also married to Gatot, who is from Semarang. We have a son together. He is looking very concerned in this photo. His name is Timur Kalana, or Timmy, as we call him in English, so my parents could pronounce his name. And the reason I bring up my family is first of all, I think it's important for us to, academics are people too. It's important I want you to get to know me a little bit more and know where I'm coming from as a foreign researcher, right? But also I mention this because this issue of cross-cultural understanding is one that's really important to me and really prominent both in my professional and my personal life, right? I have a son who has an Indonesian passport and an American passport, right? And when he becomes 18, he's going to have to choose unless they change the law in Indonesia, right? So this question of what is culture? What does it mean to move between different cultural worlds? How do we think about our identity in a globalized world where everyone is moving around and falling in love and marrying people and traveling places for work and all of this? That is not just an intellectual question for many of us, right? That is a very personal question too. So I hope that even though this talk is quite an academic talk, I hope that it will spark some thoughts amongst, the students to think about what is your own relationship to culture and what is your own relationship to this question of cross-cultural understanding, right? And also, I think, what I want to start with is very fundamental, right? When we think about this question of cross-cultural understanding, when I got the title for this course, right, cross-cultural understanding, go. I had to take a moment to step back and think about, well, let's actually think about this question of what we call culture, right? Let's not assume that we know what we're talking about when we talk about culture, right? Because there's two ways that people in the world, in sort of media and just everyday conversation, there's often two ways that we talk about culture, right? Sometimes we talk about culture as if it is a very well-defined, fixed, unchanging, coherent thing, right? I can point to something and say that is Javanese culture or that is American culture, right? But we also think of culture, there's another way to think of culture, which is as something that is fluid and changing and complex, right? Something that isn't just handed down to us from the people who came before, but something that is actively produced and reworked and influenced by its historical context and its political context, right? And this tension between culture as this kind of fixed thing that we can point at and culture as this very fluid, changing thing, this is really, I think, at the core, this tension between those two understandings of culture is at the core of a lot of different social debates of the last 300 years, and it's increasingly relevant as the world becomes both more globalized and also more polarized, right? We are never been so much in contact with each other now, and yet in many ways it also feels like we have never been so far apart from each other, right? So I think let's think about this question of how do we frame culture, right? And so I want to start basically my argument for this presentation is that it's important for us to recognize how and why culture is constantly being shaped and reshaped. And as an anthropologist, I definitely am on the side of the culture is fluid, right? And I hope you're convinced of that today. But maybe you're not, that's fine too. But I think it's important if we want to talk about cross-cultural understanding, we have to talk about how is culture itself not something that we can just assume, that is something that is shaped and reshaped, right? And it's important for us to understand, we need to recognize how culture is fluid and changing in our own culture and in others. And I think that's a basis for meaningful cross-cultural communication and understanding. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to kind of look at this question of how has culture and how has the way people think about culture and the way they think about cross-cultural understanding, how has that changed throughout Indonesia's history? So we're going to go on a little trip through time in the archipelago to kind of trace how ideas about culture have been shaped and changed over time. Right. And my hope is that going on this sort of historical journey, which, by the way, I'll show you in a moment, we're going to be very superficial. I'm going to run through like 1,000 years of history in like half an hour. So, so it's going to necessarily be kind of surface level. But my hope is that, this will help you getting a sense of how these ideas around culture and cross-cultural understanding, how they've changed in Indonesia over time. I hope that this will help you think about your own cultures and history and how you relate to these, how they've been shaped how you've been shaped by them. And hopefully this Indonesia case will help you to have a more sort of deeper and more nuanced understanding of the kinds of issues that you'll be studying in this class over the coming weeks. So I'm going to kind of move roughly chronological and talk about each of these periods, right? Starting in sort of this pre-colonial period, then the period of colonization, which was primarily the Dutch in Indonesia, looking at the two major regimes of the post-colonial period, Sukarno and Suharto, and then into democratic Indonesia for the last 25 years. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, I'm sure many of the Indonesian professors in this class already know all of this. I'm not claiming to say anything new, but just to sort of synthesize some of this and bring it together and hopefully spark some conversations today and in future classes. Okay. All right, so I want to ask the students, a couple questions, and you can either raise your hand or if you don't want to, you can also pop this in the chat. So the American scholar Benedict Anderson once called Indonesia an improbable nation. Why do you think that might be? Why do you think that Benedict Anderson would have used this term improbable? Why does he think that that is an appropriate way to describe Indonesia? And you can take a look at these maps here to give you a hint. This is a map of ethnic groups in Indonesia. The map on the right is a map of sort of religious breakdown within Indonesia. And then the map on the bottom is a map of different linguistic families, right, of the many hundreds of languages that are spoken in Indonesia. So does anyone have any idea that they could pop in the chat of why this term improbable might be being applied to Indonesia? Any thoughts? Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. There's so many different islands, ethnicities, religious beliefs, many different cultures. So the question becomes, any other thoughts? Any other thoughts of why that might make Indonesia improbable? Any other thoughts about that folks want to pop in the chat? Also biodiversity. Yes, that's a good one. Benedict Anderson wasn't thinking about that when he wrote that, but I think that's a very good one too, right? That there's a whole, in terms of environments, incredibly diverse, right? Absolutely, right? So I think one of the things that this sort of what Benedict Anderson is trying to say when he calls it improbable, yes, we'll get to Indonesian in a moment, yes, is that this is a country, as you probably already know, that is enormous. It's incredibly diverse, no matter what sort of lens you look through. And it's also very dispersed, right? When I try to explain to Americans don't know much about Indonesia, right? So whenever I try to explain to my parents or explain to my friends how big Indonesia is, I say, imagine a country the size of the United States, but instead of being one land mass, it's all islands, right? So in some ways, it doesn't quite make sense of how can this place that is so diverse be a nation, right? Be a coherent country. And that's what Benedict Anderson says when he's saying that it's improbable. So then this question comes, how do Indonesians come to see themselves as Indonesian, right? As part of what Benedict Anderson calls an imagined community, right? And an imagined community is this concept that has been very influential in sort of history and anthropology and political science. And it's inspired by Indonesia, right? A lot of people forget that when they read Anderson, is that he's actually writing about Indonesia specifically. And he calls a nation an imagined community because he says, you can never meet everyone else who lives in your country, right? You're not going to know everybody you're not on a first name basis with millions of people, right? But you imagine yourself as somehow connected to one another, right? As sharing something. So how do you come to imagine that, right? That's not something that automatically just appears. That's something that has to be built. It has to be created. People have to buy into this feeling of Indonesianness or whatever your country is. People need to buy into that, right? But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We'll come back to Indonesia as this nation and how does this idea of Indonesianness sort of emerge. But I want to kind of rewind now and go back to the pre-colonial period before European colonizers move into Southeast Asia. And think about before we had countries, before anybody had ever heard the word Indonesia, what were the markers of cultural identity in insular Southeast Asia? So by that, I mean sort of island Southeast Asia. So this kind of red-ish square I have here, right? What is the way that people are thinking about their cultural identity and their relationship to one another, right? And archaeologists and anthropologists, historians have kind of argued that there's many different ways that people are thinking about their identity, right? It might be loyalty to a ruler or multiple rulers, right? Your occupation or your profession, right? Are you a trader? Are you an artisan? Are you a scholar? Your class or social standing? Your religion, of course, is an incredibly diverse part of the world in terms of religious faith. And your language, what language do you speak, right? What's missing from this is ideas of race, right? And we'll come to that in a moment. The idea of race as like a biological marker that determines sort of categorizes you is something that isn't introduced really until Europeans arrive. And a good example of this is this idea of being Malay, right? So Malay, now understood as one of these ethnic groups throughout Southeast Asia, but particularly in Malaysia, of course. And in the pre-colonial period, being Malay can mean some combination of various things, right? It might mean that you are a subject of a Malay ruler. You're under the Malaccan Sultanate, right? It might mean that you speak one of the many different Malay dialects or languages. It might mean that you've grown up with a collection of shared traditions and folktales and food and music with others who identified as Malay. And it might mean that you're likely Muslim, although I would like to say not always, but in the historical period, not always. So this might be what is. What's missing from here is the idea of being Malay as something that is a biological race, right? And it does not come to be labeled as such until the British introduced this idea to their colonies in the 19th century, right? So the summary of this is that cultural identity is fluid and relational at this moment, right? Before colonial empires come in. So, and we can see this even in language, right? Javanese and many other Asian languages, I know Korean also has this, where the way you speak to one another depends on what your relationship is to that person, right? So this is why I don't speak Javanese. It's too complicated for me. I have to know who I am and who you are and how we relate to each other to know how to properly speak to you, right? And we see this in a lot of languages in Southeast Asia and beyond. So cultural identity is fluid and it's relational. And as a little sidebar to this, because I just find this really fascinating, when we think about pre-colonial states, right? So kingdoms, sultanates, empires, these are multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious polities, right? And they are often based on a fundamentally different understanding of power than is introduced by later Western empires, right? So scholars have talked about how, particularly in Java, but across Southeast Asia, there's this idea that political power is maintained by concentrating it in the center, and you pull others in like a magnet, right? So Majapahit is this powerful center, and others are kind of pulled into its orbit. And people have argued that this is based on a kind of Buddhist understanding, the mandala, right? The Buddhist understanding of the universe, of having this sort of core and then periphery. This is the exact opposite of how Western powers think about power, right? Western empires, when they come in, they're obsessed about borders. They're obsessed about drawing a line and saying, on this line, we are us. On that line, you are you, and we will defend this border. That's where power is located in Western empires, is on the border, right? So you see there's this really fundamental shift in how people think about this. So you can exist in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, you could be subject to multiple empires, right? I don't know if that would be a nice thing, but you could have shifting alliances, right? Your identity of who you are can depend on your relation to multiple different things. So in other words, the foundation of early Southeast Asian states has always been some form of cross-cultural understanding. It's always been built on this question of how do we speak to one another? How do we relate to one another across differences in culture, right? So how does European colonization impact how people understood what it meant to have a cultural identity? So I already mentioned in the 19th century in Europe, there's this new conceptual framework for understanding humanity, and this quickly comes to dominate all discussions of human difference. And that is this concept of race, right? So race, as it was understood in the 19th century, right, by European colonizers, the way they thought about race was this is something innately biological. You measure it by people's physical appearance. What is their skin color? What does their hair look like? What is their face shape? And it's something that is clear-cut, absolute, fixed, unchanging. And it's also the thing that is supposedly the most important factor in determining your cultural identity, right? So yes, it's important that you are, this is your religion, this is your language, but the most important thing is race, right? That's how the colonizers saw this world. And we can look at this example. Singapore and British Malaya is a great example of this. The Brits are the first to introduce this idea of a census, right? And on the census, the categories are racial categories, right, that are determined by the British colonizers. And it's very clear. There's, Europeans, and there's Chinese, and there's Indians, and there's Malay, and these are the categories, right? And as someone, I'm interested in urban studies, right? So this even impacts the way cities are built at this time. So Singapore is divided, is racially segregated based on these different categories, right? So if you go to Little India, it's like, oh, cute Little India today. But actually, that's based on a sort of racial hierarchy and segregation that the British were literally building into the foundation of the city itself. Now, why do you think, again, if you want to pop in the chat, sort of, why do you think that the British or the Dutch or the French, why is race why are they thinking about race in this way? Why is this the way that they want to label their new colonial sort of subjects in their new territories? What might be the reason? What might be some reasons why this is something that they're doing? If anybody has some ideas, you can I'll wait a moment, you can pop them in the chat. Any thoughts? Well, there's a couple different, oh, sorry. Yes, I will repeat the question. Yes. Why would European colonizers use this idea of race? Why is that? Why is it important to a British official, for example, to label his population to label, the people in this territory by race? Why would that be the category that European colonizers are using, as opposed to all these other types of ways that people are identifying themselves and experiencing culture? Yes, Ita. Yes, so that's one of the reasons. So part of this is there's a couple different things at play. One of them is very clearly about white superiority, white supremacy, right? One of this is it's about creating a hierarchy, right? Because of course, race at this time, they weren't thinking about it in this nice, everybody's equal. They were thinking about it as a literal hierarchy, right? So part of it is a way to justify colonialism, right? Another part of it is to make what seemed to colonizers as a messy situation, to make it legible to them, to make it clear, to make them feel like they knew what was going on when really they had no idea what was going on, right? I think that's something that people think that, we forget that a lot of the colonial powers were just kind of winging it. Like they really didn't understand. They didn't understand the people that they were, and in many cases, they didn't want to, right? And so instead of kind of dealing with this messiness of different languages and religions and all these sort of, complexity that we saw in the pre-colonial period, they're like, let's simplify this. What do you look like? Okay, you are this race. And if you are this race, then this is your job and this is your place in society, right? So it's also a way, and then the final way too. So it's about supposedly clarity when really they didn't understand what was going on at all. It was about supremacy, right? Justifying colonialism. And it was also about dividing and conquering, right? If you divide people into groups, then you can, and sort of tell them that they're fundamentally different from one another, then that's a very easy way that's a very strategic way to keep a hold on power, right? So you tell people that they are different from one another. That's a way of kind of, kind of fundamentally cutting off people from one another and make it difficult for them to communicate and understand one another. And so then this becomes this justification for colonial power to kind of step in and manage that relationship, right? So it's a way of shoring up power by dividing people, right? So what happens in the Dutch East Indies, another thing that happens is that colonial anthropologists, so this is part of the dark history of the discipline of anthropology, colonial anthropologists set out in the 19th century to study Indonesia's many diverse communities as quote unquote races, right? So there's lots of Dutch anthropologists wandering around and other people who weren't even anthropologists, but just like thought they were anthropologists, right? Wandering around and saying, oh, this is Batak culture, this is Javanese culture, this is Balinese culture, right? And documenting what they considered to be quote unquote traditional customs, belief, dress, etc., in books and museums, right? So when we look at sort of texts from the colonial period, when we look at museum collections from ethnographic museums, we see that there's a really sort of crystallization. There's this sense of, okay, this is what Javanese culture is because we, the Dutch anthropologists, have identified this, right? Two examples, in the process, a lot of times colonial anthropologists are actually freezing in time what are really dynamic changing cultures. They'll freeze them, or they'll even fabricate some aspects of culture, right? So two examples of this, one is with Javanese culture. There's a book called On the Subject of Java by a guy named Pemberton. It's a famous book where basically his argument is that one of his arguments is that the Dutch looked at Javanese culture, which was many, many different things, right? And they looked at high court culture. They looked at the courts of the sultans in Jogja and Surakarta, and they said, that's Javanese culture. Everything else you people are doing in villages and in Semarang along the coast, all of that is low culture, right? That's low culture. That's not pure Javanese culture. The pure stuff is what's going on in the courts, right? So that's the stuff we need to preserve. And everything else we'll just sort of forget about, right? So even today, that has persisted, right? When we think about Javanese culture, we often think about these very kind of royal sort of traditions and a very particular version of Javanese culture. But the Dutch anthropologists came in and said, aha, that is Javanese culture, right? And in some cases, they totally fabricated stuff. If anyone's been to Bali, and particularly if you are a tourist in Bali, you may have experienced something called the kecak dance or the fire dance, which is this very dramatic dance that is done. You can see here, they usually do it over the cliffs. And there's sort of a stadium where all the tourists sit. And then there's the dance that goes down below and there's a lot of fire, right? This is presented as a traditional Balinese dance. When actually, though, when we look at the history of this dance, it's invented. It was invented in the 1920s and 30s by Dutch ethnomusicologists who were working with Balinese dance experts. And they basically kind of came up with this, right? They were like, oh, this is fire, great, you know? And this became a tourist product and is now seen as something that is traditional, when in fact it's something that was invented relatively recently. And there's a lot of examples like this all over the world, right? So what this means is that Dutch colonizers promoted this vision of the archipelago's diverse population as a fixed set of clearly defined, unchanging, racially oriented boxes into which everyone's supposed to fit, right? You are Javanese, you are Batak, you are Dayak, etc., which is simply not true, right? That doesn't reflect the complexity. People are moving around and marrying each other and converting to different religions and learning new languages, right? But the vision of culture in the Dutch colonial view was very much fixed. And this is really on display, literally on display. If you go to the Netherlands, if you go to the Volkenkunde Museum in Leiden, you will see on display a collection of 350 dolls that were made for Queen Wilhelmina in the late 1800s. So she's the Queen of the Netherlands, right? She was a child at the time. And so the gift of the Dutch East Indies to her was these very large dolls. And there are two, there's a pair, a man and a woman, in sort of traditional dress, or what is seen as traditional dress, and they represent each ethnic group in the country that Dutch anthropologists had observed. So there's like a Dayak pair, there's a Batak pair, there's a Balinese pair, right? So literally the queen is sort of, has this whole array of sort of colonial subjects to literally play with, right? There's also this, as you can imagine, this kind of like putting people into separate boxes is also something very dangerous, right? So this is a really dark episode in the history of colonization in Indonesia, is the Chinese massacre of October 1740, where essentially it's quite complicated, but essentially in Batavia, a group of Chinese, sort of the Chinese community was frustrated with the VOC, with the Dutch, for being treated unfairly. And there was sort of an attack that happened. And then in response to that, the VOC, the Dutch, basically kind of incited the Malay and Javanese and other groups to attack the Chinese, right? So you get this creation of this idea of Chinese Indonesians as a sort of what sometimes scholars refer to as a quote unquote internal other. So a group that is somehow not quite local, right? Even though a lot of these people had lived there and their families had lived there for generations, right? But this idea, again, of divide and rule, you set this idea of the Chinese as this separate group of people who maybe are not quite Indonesian enough, right? That idea is something invented by the colonial powers, and it's invented as a way to control people, right? And in the aftermath of this, people are forced to live in Chinatowns, right? So a lot of the Chinatowns that we see across Indonesia and across the world actually are a result of racist policies that forced people to, you're not allowed to live anywhere else or conduct business anywhere else in the city. You have to stay here, right? So this idea of dividing people into boxes is something that can be very dangerous too, of course, and serves the colonial powers. What's ironic, though, is that the experience of colonialism and the desire to overthrow it fosters a new urgency to build solidarities across cultural lines that have been drawn by the Dutch, right? So this whole project, this colonial project of dividing people up, right, and managing them in this colonial system, this experience causes actually the opposite. It causes people, particularly in the early 20th century, to start thinking about, wait a second, how do we come together now? How do we fight against this colonial occupation, right? So early anti-colonial nationalists start to work on this question of how do we create a sense of shared Indonesian identity across this archipelago, right? And there's a lot of different ways that this starts to happen, even in the colonial period. One of the classic moments is something called the Sumpah Pemuda, or the Youth Pledge, where a group of students get together and they make this pledge: we are one land, Indonesia, one people, Indonesians, one language, Indonesian. And that language thing, this was mentioned earlier in the chat, language is really key. Indonesia is one of the few cases in the history of the world where a new national language has successfully been implemented, right? And everyone's bought into it, right? But when people were deciding what language, when the nationalists were sort of deciding what language they wanted their future country to have, obviously they weren't going to choose Dutch because of its association with colonialism. But they also weren't going to choose Javanese or one of the other local languages because that would seem, well, for Javanese, it's very hierarchical. They wanted something more democratic in the way people could speak to one another. And they wanted something that everyone could communicate with together, right? Literally, they wanted something that was not associated with one ethnic group over another, that wasn't about, one group kind of having power over the other. And so in the Indonesian language is really a really extraordinary example of a successful, implementation of a national language, that people are able to speak to one another. And once they're able to speak to one another, they're able to imagine the future and a future as Indonesians. So we move into this newly independent period. So the Proclamation of Independence is in 1945, and Sukarno becomes the great nationalist leader, becomes the first president of Indonesia. And so this question of, on the one hand, it's like, yay, we have an independent Indonesia, right? We have this new country, but this project of becoming Indonesian is just getting started, right? How do we convince people to think about themselves as Indonesian in addition to all their other kinds of identities? And this becomes a really critical political and cultural project through the 50s and 60s. And a huge range of artists, writers, performers, musicians, scholars, leaders are involved in this project. And there's a great book, if you are interested, great book called Heirs to World Culture, which is about this period of the 50s and 60s, right? So this is where I asked you, I don't know if everyone got a chance to do this, but I hope that the Bandung conference speech was distributed ahead of time. But this idea basically, well, let me go back for a second to talk a little bit about Sukarno. So Sukarno's is very much as the Indonesians in the audience will know, he really understood this idea that you had to convince people, you had to get people thinking about themselves as Indonesian, right? And he really set out to make Indonesians, he wanted to make Indonesians proud of themselves. He wanted to make them sort of on both a domestic and international level. He wanted to show the world that Indonesia had arrived, that they could sit at the table with the great powers of the world. And one of the clearest articulations of this vision is the Bandung Conference, right? And his opening address. So I imagine that most of students have heard of the Bandung Conference because you come from various parts of Asia. I'm here to tell you that nobody in America knows about the Bandung Conference, and I've made it my personal task to try to teach American students about it in all my classes. I think it's an incredibly important moment in the history of the world that Americans have conveniently forgotten. But this is to refresh your memory. This is this conference that Indonesia hosts in the city of Bandung in 1955. And it brings together the leaders of nearly all the independent countries of Asia and Africa at the time. So it's a real who's who of anti-colonial leaders. And I hope folks had a chance to read it because my question now, and I'm hoping folks will put some stuff in the chat, is in this opening address to the delegates, he says a lot of stuff. Sukarno's a great speech maker. The man can make a great speech, right? So he says a lot of interesting stuff. But what does he have to say about diversity and cross-cultural understanding specifically? So have a thought, maybe take a look, and I'll also pull this up in a moment. I'll pull up the speech, the PDF of it. And let's see if we can find together some examples. Let me open this 1 second. Okay, I'm actually going to stop sharing and I'm going to share my, let's see. Okay, here we go. All right. So let's kind of focus on, let's go to a part, let's see. I can find the bit. where he starts talking. Well, he talks about a lot here. He goes on for quite a while. All right. Okay. Let's start maybe taking a read. Let's just take a moment to read this page. So I'll keep it up here and we'll take a moment to read it, where he starts, "Sisters and brothers, let this conference be a great success. In spite of diversity that exists among us, participants, let this conference be a great success." Yeah, I'll just read it out. Yes, there's diversity among us. Who denies it? Small and great nations are represented here with people professing almost every religion under the sun. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Confucianism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, Shintoism, and others. Almost every political faith we encounter here: democracy, monarchism, theocracy, and its innumerable variants. And practically every economic doctrine has representative in this hall: Marxism, socialism, capitalism, communism, all in their manifold variations and combinations. But what harm is in diversity when there is unity and desire? This conference does not oppose each other. It is a conference of brotherhood. It is not an Islam conference or a Christian conference, not a Buddhist conference. It is not a meeting of Malayans, nor one of Arabs, nor one of Indo-Aryan stock. It is not an exclusive club either, not a bloc that seeks to oppose any other bloc. Rather, it is a body of enlightened, tolerant opinion, which seeks to impress on the world that all men in all countries have their place under the sun. To impress upon the world that it is possible to live with one another, meet together, speak with each other without losing one's individual identity, and yet to contribute to the general understanding of matters of common concern, and to develop a true consciousness of the interdependence of men and nations for their well-being and survival on this earth. And then he goes on to say a little bit about, let's see, sisters and brothers, Indonesia is Asia, Africa in small. It is a country with many religions and many faiths. We have Indonesian Muslims, we have Christians, we have Siba Buddhists, we have peoples with other creeds. We have many ethnic units such as Acehnese, Batak, Central Sumatrans, Sundanese, Central Javanese, Madurese, Torajans, Balinese, etc. But thank God we have our will to unity. We have our Pancasila. We practice live and let live principle. We are tolerant to one another. Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, Unity University, is the motto of the nation state. We are one nation. So let's go back. So think about that. So what are, if we take a moment to look at just that, and he goes on, but if we take a moment to just look at that piece, what is, let me make sure this goes back to the right slide. No, it did not. That's okay. I'll go through. Okay. But how is he thinking about this question of diversity, and what is his message to the delegates? What does he have to say about cross-cultural understanding? What stands out to you in that speech? What's his argument? And you can pop this in the chat. Any thoughts? Well, I think there's a couple. Yeah, exactly. Yes. It's this question of challenges and also opportunities, right? As he says, this isn't a problem that we're all different, right? This isn't a problem. In fact, it's just important. That's actually our strength, right? Our strength is that we are all different, and yet we are united through a similar desire for, in this case, world peace, because he's saying this in the context, the backdrop to this is the Cold War, and that everyone's afraid that the Americans and the Russians are going to nuke each other at any moment, right? So there's this question, there's this very kind of dangerous, stressful political situation in the background. And Sukarno's saying, hey, we in this room, the recently decolonized countries of the world, we don't want to be a part of this mess, right? We want to be a force for positive understanding, right, in the world. And he's also saying, not in the quote I just read out, but a different part, he talks a lot about, yes, we're very different, right? We have very different cultures, different religions, different political systems, but we've all experienced colonialism, right? We've all had this shared historical experience that gives us a particular sort of view of the world and a role to play in that world. And what's important in this, I think, too, is that his speech, he's talking to two different people, right? Or two different audiences. He is talking to an international audience, of course. He's talking to all of the delegates in that room, but he's also talking to a domestic audience. He's talking to Indonesians. He's also saying to them, within our own country, you may not have known each other before, but now we are one nation, right? So how do we kind of unify together around this? So in the 50s and 60s, just two quick examples of this that I think are really important and really illustrate the unique understanding of culture that emerges in the 50s and 60s. So one of the things that Sukarno wants to do is introduce the world to Indonesian culture. But introducing the world to Indonesian culture also means introducing Indonesians to one another. And a great example of this are these dance troupes that were put together. So in the 50s and 60s, basically, the government of Indonesia brought together dancers from all over the islands, right? Brought them to Jakarta, made them into a dance troupe, and then sent that dance troupe all over the world, right? To basically do, participate in festivals and showcases and to kind of introduce the world to Indonesian culture. And we have this great image actually down here on the bottom is actually an image of Chinese dancers learning Balinese dance. So these dance troupes would also teach dancers in the various countries that they went to how to do Indonesian dances as this way to foster cross-cultural understanding, right? What's interesting, though, is that when we read, there was an anthropologist and historian who went through and interviewed all of these dancers who are now in their they're now quite old, but interviewed them and said, what was it like to be part of this dance troupe in the 50s and 60s? And one of the things that a lot of these dancers said was, this was the first time I'd ever met Indonesians from other parts of the country, right? Everyone comes from all over the archipelago, meets in Jakarta, and all of a sudden, I've met a Sumatran for the first time. I've met someone from Aceh for the first time, right? So it's the first time that people are starting to think of themselves as Indonesian. And also people taught each other their dances. So the Balinese dancers would do Sumatran dances and the Sumatran dancers would do, dances from Sulawesi, right? Or from Sunda. So there's this idea of we are all Indonesian and we're proud of our sort of local culture, but we can also share it with others, both beyond our country and also within our country. And in popular culture at this time, people are mixing styles of traditional and modern, foreign and local. They're experimenting with new expressions of personal identity, of being, you can be, as Sukarno says, you can be both sort of Indonesian, you can be Javanese, you can be Indonesian, and you can be a citizen of the world. And those things are not in contradiction, right? There's a great film that kind of articulates the spirit of this time and the way in which people are creatively, mixing all sorts of different cultural influences. The film is Tiga Dara, which you can find on Indonesian Netflix. And essentially in the film, it's about these three sisters. And one of the interesting things as if you look at this through an academic lens, the film, is that the sisters are always wearing very different clothes. There's one that's always wearing kabaya, always wearing this very traditional sort of Javanese outfit. And then there are other sisters who are wearing, sort of more Western dress. One girl, I didn't have a picture of it, but one girl even wears blue jeans, right, which were very new at the time. And there's also a great series of scenes where they're holding a bunch of dance parties because the plot of the film is basically that the oldest sister is really old. She's 29, so they want to get her married off. So they're creating all these different dance scenes to invite people over to their house and hope that she can meet a guy. But they have a Malay dance. They have sort of a traditional dance that they invite everyone over to do. And then the next scene is they're dancing to rock and roll music, right? So there's this real mix, and those things are not seen as in contradiction to one another, right? In this moment of sort of cultural expression and creativity. And even in terms of architecture, again, I work in an urban studies department, so I'm always thinking about the built environment and architecture. Even in architecture, we see this kind of playful experimentation. So this is a screenshot from the film. You see here, they're riding around on a motorbike. And in the background are these very odd looking houses, right? These houses are part of a kind of architectural movement that happened very briefly in the 50s and 60s across Indonesia. It's sometimes referred to as janky architecture, and I'll say in a moment why it's called that. But essentially, you come across these houses, and there's a very famous one in Indonesia, in Semarang, called Apotek Sputnik, which is one of my favorites, which is it's a pharmacy that was where the owner of the pharmacy was like, I'm into the space race, Sputnik, and all this stuff. Build me a pharmacy that has a space theme, right? But all these different, we see across the archipelago, particularly middle class, upper middle class Indonesians, wanting to live in homes that are not sort of Dutch colonial Western homes, but also not traditional kind of, customary homes, but they want to live in something that articulates, expresses the optimism and the creativity of this moment that they're living in the 50s and 60s. And so you get these very playful houses that mix all different sorts of styles, right? And these are called, a lot of times they're called janky. The word janky, there's a couple different ideas about where it comes from. One of the theories is that it comes from the word Yankee, so that there's an American influence. And in fact, there's a great, I'm not going to play the music because I'm afraid it won't go over, but there's a great little song called Celana Janky, Yankee Pants, which means blue jeans, by an Indonesian rock group in the 50s that talks about this kind of mixing of cultures and this adaptation of some American styles as well as Indonesian styles. And so what this all comes to mean is that, and what I want to kind of summarize from this, if I can find my notes, is that this is a period in the 50s and 60s of exploration and experimentation. People want to see themselves as Indonesian and understand each other across cultural differences and assert themselves confidently on the world stage. And the idea at the time is that, yes, you can borrow things from Western culture. You can borrow things from traditional culture. You don't have to be in a box. Being Indonesian doesn't mean this kind of stiff, unchanging thing, the way that the Dutch wanted it to be. But people can be multiple things, and that's not in contradiction, right? Then lastly, this changes, though, a bit with authoritarian rule. So General Suharto comes to power and institutes a form of authoritarian rule that lasts for about 30 years. And his attitude towards culture also really shifts dramatically. And there are several scholars who've written about this in different ways. I'm just going to give a very sort of a couple examples. But Suharto makes a shift towards a more, I guess you could say, conservative or rigid understanding of culture and of this idea of unity and diversity in Indonesia. One of the things is that personally, he himself styled himself as a kind of keeper of Javanese tradition, right? So, and he also had this whole sort of very, fraught, complex relationship with the sultans of Java, the sultanates in Surakarta in particular. So he was always kind of trying to associate himself with that traditional Javanese royal lineage, right? In the way he dressed and the way he's photographed, the kinds of projects that he takes on. A really wonderful example that, again, many scholars have kind of picked apart and written about. A great kind of physical expression of how Suharto and his regime is thinking about Indonesian culture is something called Taman Mini Indonesia Indah, which means beautiful Indonesia in miniature park. And so this is a park. I'm sure many of the people on the call have been here before, maybe on a school field trip at some point. But this was a pet project of Suharto's wife. She went to Disneyland, and she came back from Disneyland, and she said, you know what, we need to build a park, a theme park, basically, that will introduce Indonesians to Indonesia. And so the park itself, it was actually quite controversial at the time because an enormous amount of money was poured into making this, as you can imagine. And there were some grumblings from people about, was this a good use of funds? But essentially what the park is, there's a big lake in the middle, and in the middle of the lake, they've created these islands in the shape of Indonesia, the archipelago. And then around the lake, there are these different pavilions, and each pavilion is assigned to a region of Indonesia, right? So you have the Balinese pavilion and the central Javanese pavilion, and etc. And within each pavilion, there is oftentimes traditional architecture and there will be people sort of dressed in traditional costume that's associated with that group, and doing sort of different dances and things like that. And the idea was that Indonesians could come to Taman Mini, they could come to this park in Jakarta, and they could see the rest of their country, right? They could sort of experience the diversity of their country, and they didn't have to go to all these other islands. They could just go to the theme park. And even today, I find it kind of funny that a lot of times when Westerners come to Indonesia for the first time, they are told like, oh, you don't need to go to the parts of Indonesia, just go to this park, right? But it's a very I think I'm going to try, I have time to do this. I'm going to try to show you a video clip from the inauguration of this park. It's a little bit tricky it may not work very well. So let me try to do this. I'm going to have to use this. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is a video clip of Suharto's wife giving a speech inaugurating this park that she's built. And the video quality is very poor, the sound quality is very poor, so I don't expect you to be able to like glean that much from it. And she's speaking in Indonesian as well, of course, but I want you just to look at the kinds of images that you see, the people that show up in this video. So it's about 2 minutes long, so we'll just watch it a bit.
Kalau suka-suka dan segala jerih payah selama 4 tahun itu telah terwujud hasilnya. Karena itu kami bersyukur kehadirat Tuhan Yang Maha Esa. Kami merasa lega karena gagasan pembangunan taman ini dimengerti oleh masyarakat. Tanpa pengertian itu, taman ini tidak mungkin terselesaikan. Sebab sejak semula kami menyadari bahwa pembangunan taman ini hanya mungkin dilaksanakan dengan gotong royongan masyarakat dan akan dipersembahkan kepada masyarakat. Para hadirin yang terhormat, ciri utama dari taman ini adalah penampilan Indonesia yang besar dalam bentuknya yang kecil. Seperti yang kita saksikan bersama di sini. Kita jumpai rumah-rumah adat atau bangunan-bangunan lain dari ujung ke ujung tanah air kita yang merupakan warisan kebudayaan bangsa Indonesia yang tidak ternilai harganya. Kami merasa perlu memelihara warisan kebudayaan yang demikian, terutama untuk mencegah kemungkinan punah karena dilanda oleh tuntutan-tuntutan pembangunan masyarakat modern. Kami merasa perlu mengabadikan sebagian warisan kebudayaan itu justru pada sekarang, pada masa mereka yang mengerti segala hal ekwalnya masih ada, mengerti bentuk lahiriahnya, dan memahami semangat yang terkandung di dalamnya.
Right.
Di tempat
I'm not sure if any of that came across, and that's fine. Sometimes Zoom is not always reliable when it comes to sort of showing video, I find. Sometimes it's really choppy. But I hope that sort of the reason I wanted to show that is there's a couple images that come across in there that I think are important for us to kind of pay attention to, right? So she's basically, the wife is kind of putting together, Suharto's wife is inaugurating this. In those images that you saw, is there anything that stands out to folks? Is there anything that looks familiar in the kinds of people or, things that we see in that film clip, or that hopefully you were able to see? Anything that looks familiar compared to things that we've already talked about in this lecture? Thoughts? I think there's one thing that stood out to some scholars. Yes, diversity in traditional costumes. Yeah. So there's one thing that stood out to scholars when they've analyzed, Taman Mini as this cultural product, right? Or as an expression of the way that the Suharto regime was thinking about culture and thinking about Indonesia's diversity, right? What we see is a kind of, and this is, scholars have debated this, so you don't necessarily have to agree with this, but this is something that some scholars have argued, is that Suharto's vision of culture is actually a return to a kind of colonial model, right? This idea of people divided into these distinct ethnic groups, and each group has unchanging traditional customs, dance, dress, music, architecture, right? So this idea of these kind of couples, especially like the guy and the girl in, traditional garb standing out in front of, the rumah adat. Some people have compared this to those dolls that were given to Queen Wilhelmina, right? This idea that you can look at the empire or you can look at the nation in this snapshot, right? Why is this, if this is a return to a kind of colonial, much more rigid understanding of culture, why is Suharto doing this? There's a couple different theories that scholars have proposed. One theory is that this is an attempt to depoliticize certain groups that are resisting the Suharto regime. So this is also the time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when there are various groups across Indonesia trying to break away, where there are various kinds of, it's not all nice and easy. There's all sorts of kind of challenges going on, right? And this way of saying, oh, well, you're all part of Indonesia. We're going to respect your culture, and we're going to respect, and by that we mean your architecture and your dress and your dance. Some scholars have argued that this is a way to distract attention from the political issues that are going on at the time, right? To kind of say, oh, we're all happy, like as a distraction tactic, right? And then, of course, another argument is that this is about tourism, too. This is about development. Pembangunan, development, is this key part of Suharto's vision of the nation. And tourism plays a huge role in that, right? This is the time when Indonesia opens up to foreign investment. Sukarno was very skeptical of tourism. He was not a fan of it. He saw it as a form of neocolonization, but Suharto is very comfortable with it, right? And traditional culture becomes an asset for tourism. And we see this in the colonial period, and we see this in the Suharto period. So the poster at the bottom there is a poster from the Dutch colonial period for tourists to come to Bali. And we see very similar type of imagery with the kinds of tourist posters that are produced in the 70s and 80s, and also today, right? So I think tourism and culture and the role that tourism plays in culture is a topic beyond this conversation today, but it's one I'm super fascinated in. And I think that tourism actually has a huge impact on how we think about culture, both our own and other cultures, right? And sometimes that can be good, and sometimes that can be not so good. And there's even some scholars who have argued that Suharto sort of invents a lot of different traditions, right? And this idea of the invention of tradition is actually a concept that comes from sort of historians in the 1980s. And that it can be seen as a way of kind of shoring up his own sort of political authority by associating himself particularly with sort of Javanese traditional authority, right? And I think thinking about fashion, I know fashion is something you're going to be studying in this course. One of the really kind of obvious examples of this is Suharto's daughter's wedding. So she has a wedding that is this very extravagant royal Javanese wedding, right? So the way that they're dressed is very much kind of modeled off of sort of royal Javanese culture. And this wedding sets a trend in Indonesia for standardized wedding packets with ethnically defined rituals and dress. And there's a great, the book on the subject of Java, John Pemberton actually goes to Surakarta, and in the 80s, he interviews all of these people who work for like formal like rental services. So if you need like your wedding outfit, you'll go and rent it from these guys. And he interviews them, and he gets these really great little stories about them saying that, people started coming into his shop in the 70s and 80s and saying, hey, I want to be dressed like a Javanese king. And he was confused. He didn't have any of this stuff, right? And he said wedding attire in the 50s was a cap, a plain coat, pants, or sarong. If a groom had shown up in aristocratic costume, formal batik, kris, and all that, he'd been laughed at out of the place, right? So this idea that sort of fashion and trends in even something like weddings actually is linked to shifting ideas about what is culture, right? And also taking their cue from what political leaders are doing at the time. By the way, if you're ever in Indonesia and you get an invitation to go to a wedding, please go. It's like it's incredible. So finishing up, when we come back to the contemporary moment, right? So Suharto steps down in 98, and the last 25, 26 years in Indonesia have been a time of incredible political, economic, and cultural and social change, right? So how are people thinking about culture and cross-cultural communication and understanding today? Well, I think you have some familiar dynamics, right? On the one hand, this idea of sort of distinct, well-defined cultural groups is still very much part of particularly tourism promotions. This image right here is from a hotel in Bali. So looking at that is certainly has a lot of salience, has a lot of importance. But also you see the same thing that you saw in the 50s and 60s. You see people experimenting with and, different forms of art and different forms of dress and different forms of identity, and not seeing these as in contradiction, right? So the famous metal band of with Muslim girls in hijab, which of course has become famous worldwide, is an example of this really sort of creative mixing that people are doing and have always done, right? Since 98, we also do see, I think, one phenomenon are new conceptions of cultural identity that reach across old borders and categories, right? So one story is the story of Chinese Indonesian identity, right? Under Suharto, there was a lot of suppression of Chinese Indonesian identity. Things, it wasn't allowed to have sort of Chinese language newspapers or even signage. There was, a lot of restrictions on celebrating Chinese events, things like New Year. Since 98, that is completely transformed, right? And you see much more in the public realm, people and even non-Chinese Indonesians celebrating Imlek, right? And participating in sort of the preservation and rediscovery of Chinese heritage. And you also see a lot of young people reclaiming the language, right? Because for a long time it wasn't spoken. What's interesting here is that a lot of times when people are learning, want to reconnect with a Chinese identity, they're learning Mandarin, right? Which is not actually the language that would have been spoken by most Chinese Indonesians if we look historically. It would have been Hakka or Hokkien or these other kinds of dialects that come from southern China, because that's where a lot of immigrants were coming from China over the centuries. So what we see actually is a kind of like a sort of reaching out to mainland China as a way of kind of rediscovering a Chinese identity, right? And the same way with like the role and the way people think about their identity as Muslims and as part of the larger Muslim world, right? So we also see a trend of more and more architecture that sort of, and fashion as well, that is taking its cue from Middle Eastern styles, sort of global Islamic styles, as opposed to some more local styles that may have existed in the past. And this is just a way people are changing and thinking about, what are the kinds of connections and cultural identities that stretch beyond the nation, right? That stretch beyond my immediate sort of local environment. And then what I'll finish on today, this is my last slide, is this question of authenticity, right? So a lot of times when we talk about culture, and I think particularly when we talk about culture in Asia, for some reason, people always come up with this question of, oh, is it authentic, right? Where is authentic culture? And certainly tourists are always searching for what's the authentic, right? As an anthropologist, I understand this desire to think about authenticity and this desire for the authentic, right? We live in a world where things sometimes don't feel very authentic, and so we desire that, right? But what I would say is that if authentic means unchanging and original and pure, then nothing is truly authentic and nothing really has been. Culture has always changed. It's always been fluid. It's always adapted. It's always mixed, right? There is no kind of pure, unchanging, primordial thing that we can look to. So I think, one of the things that I would encourage us or encourage you to think about as you continue on this course is to shift your, or even when you kind of think about your own culture or think about, other folks that you are interacting with, is not, is this culture authentic, right? But this question of autonomy, right? Do people have the autonomy, the freedom, the control to make their own culture and to determine what they think that is, right? And I would argue that Indonesians today and in many parts of the world have way more autonomy in this moment to creatively decide what they want to consider to be their culture, Indonesian or otherwise, right? Much more autonomy than they had in the colonial period or even the Sukarno or Suharto period, where those decisions were being made for them a lot of the times, right? So I think shifting our view from what is authentic to do people have autonomy and sort of the ability to make that sort of choices and make that culture for themselves and decide what is relevant and what isn't relevant anymore. That is really where we should be thinking about these things, right? So I hope that, terima kasih, I hope that this was useful in some way. I hope that this also gives you a kind of good foundation for asking some questions of yourself and others, thinking about, what does cross-cultural understanding mean? And what are the ways in which culture itself is always changing? And how does that make us more understanding of each other and understanding of the nuances of each other's cultures and our own culture? So thank you. That is my presentation for today, and I'm happy to chat about things and answer any questions. And I would also love to hear what some of you think about some of the things that that I've presented, or what your own experiences are with these kinds of questions. So thank you very much.
Terima kasih banyak, Lauren. Thank you very much for your presentation. Such an fascinating and compact presentation about Indonesian culture, about culture in Indonesia, about how the dynamics of this culture is developing growth from pre-colonial period to this modern period. And if I can point some, from my point is, Indonesian is so, maybe I think banyak pengalaman. There's many experience we've done about this organization and about the authoritarian, and all of these have impact in Indonesian culture. So there is shifting question about the culture when there is culture as tool in politics when the Suharto regime, and then today we see about how this culture as an expressive tool from young, from the youth thing, and that's sangat mengesankan tentang gaya yang Lauren paparkan. Mungkin itu teman-teman. Jadi this session is question and answer session or discussion. So if you have any question to Lauren, you can open your audio or you can write down your question on the chat box. Is there any question for Lauren?
Questions are also if people have, particularly with some of the Indonesians in the audience, if I've gotten anything wrong, please correct me. And also, like, if you have experience with or thoughts about some of these kinds of issues. And I would say you're very right, Mas Didit, that Indonesia is an incredibly diverse place and has an incredibly diverse set of experiences, right, historically and in the present. And I think that can be said for almost any, community in the world, but certainly in Indonesia, it's very, yes, you said it leaves a real impression, right? It is quite, we see a real kind of change. And I hope that some of the students who are from other parts of Asia, maybe some of this might ring true with what you know about the histories of your own countries, right? Because a lot of this stuff particularly the colonial influence, is something that has been is not only Indonesia experienced, right? That is shared across. Maybe it's expressed in different ways, but there are these shared experiences that in how culture has been used, as you say, Titit, very well, as a tool in many cases, as a sort of active expression, but also a political tool in some ways. So, yes, I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts.
Silahkan teman-teman kalau ada pertanyaan atau mau berbagi tentang pandangan kalian budaya Indonesia. Lauren sangat menantikan kalau ada teman-teman yang mau berbagi. Or maybe let me first. Oh, Akmal. Mas Akmal.
Halo, Mas.
Please.
Ya, halo Mbak Lauren. Ya, thank you Mas Didit. I want to ask about Jenki style ya.
Yeah.
Tadi sudah dijelaskan tentang itu. Ya, saya penasaran jadinya.
Yeah.
Nowadays, Jenki style house are rarely seen in Indonesia, I think. Yeah, I'm interested in understanding why this architectural style was popular in the past. Was it because it was well suited to Indonesian climate or weather? Also, why has this style fallen out of favor in recent times? Gitu. Saya sudah, kenapa semakin sini semakin jarang saya melihat
Iya, betul.
arsitektur seperti ini gitu. Malah justru rumah-rumah di Indonesia saat ini tuh lebih ke gaya-gaya arsitektural luar gitu atau Eropa.
Ya,
Yang
betul.
menurut saya pikir itu tidak sesuai dengan iklim dan cuaca di Indonesia gitu.
Ya, betul, betul, Mas. Yeah, I think Janki architecture is totally fascinating, and I have to thank and shout out in Semarang the people who introduced me to Janki architecture back in 2015. The artist group Oratoret, which is a group of artists, one of them bought a old janky house, which now, if I forget what street it's on, but if you want some nice ribs, it's Tandhook Ribs. It's a nice restaurant and art space now that they turned it into. And the house was a janky house. And so they decided, this art collective decided, or comunitas really, decided, hey, let's do a research project on the history of this architecture form, right? And at the time I was in Indonesia, in Semarang, and they very generously invited me to tag along. And we did a lot of research about mapping where these buildings are in the city, and also looking into the history of the people who designed them and built them. And so before I answer your question, Mas Akmal, I'll just say that there are a couple books and that are really great on this topic. One is a book by Tariq Khalil, which is called, I'll put it in the chat. It's called Retronesia. And it's a big coffee table book. I think you might be able to get it in Peri Plus, but I can also send you a PDF. That is a collection of images of these buildings across the archipelago, because this wasn't just happening in Java. And then there's also a great book that was written actually by Oratoret, and I'm going to forget what it's called, but wait 1 second. Maybe Mas Umam can correct me, but one of the architects who, actually he wasn't even a trained architect, he was an artist, who designed a lot of the janky buildings in Semarang is a guy named Oy Tong An, who is related to Oy Tong Ham. But actually we tracked down his son who lives in the Netherlands, and his son has literally chests full of archives that his father put together of all of his work in the 50s and 60s in Semarang. So from that, they put together a really great book that you can get on Google Books that's in Indonesian, actually, that's all about the history of this individual. So long story short, I think that at the time, janky was this expression of sort of creativity and personality, right? So a lot of times what we forget is that a lot of janky buildings are not public buildings. There are some, but most of them are private buildings, right? They're people's homes and people's shops. And so Sukarno was very busy building these big, monumental structures in Jakarta, Bung Karno Stadium and the Monas and all this stuff, this very grand expression of Indonesian national identity. But then middle-class Indonesians were also thinking about, okay, how do I express my own kind of creativity and personality in the place that I live in? Right. And I don't want to go back to this old I don't want to live in a colonial villa, but I also don't want to go live in, a traditional house. I want something new and fresh and unique. And that was what they were delivered, right? And so a lot of the people who built these buildings were not trained architects. They were artists, they were graphic designers, and they sort of were free from all of that architectural training, and they just created things that they liked, right? And I think that's something, and that their clients liked, right? Appletech Sputnik is a wonderful example of that. The guy's like, hey, I'm into the space race. Build me a Sputnik themed, and I just love that. And I think that it speaks to this moment of freedom and borrowing from other cultures, borrowing from the West, because there is certainly an influence from American architecture at the time, right? So it's not that this is uniquely Indonesian, right? There is influences from the outside, but that they are being adapted to the Indonesian context. And you're right about the climate thing, right? So this is before everybody has air conditioners. So that's a big part of this too, is that the people who were designing these buildings were taking some ideas from here and some ideas for there, and then they were adapting them to the climate, so that it would be comfortable and make sense in a tropical climate, right? And as far as today, I mean, there is, I think, a revival of interest in janky buildings, maybe from a very small group of people. But I do think that you find more and more I think it's also part of this kind of retro trend, right? Like, I don't know if you've been to in Jakarta, there's what is it called? The Jamu place. Wisora Jamu, or, like these kind of coffee shops that have this sort of cute retro 50s, 60s look to them. I do think that as that becomes sort of a trend, people will pay more attention to these buildings and see them as special. But you're right. I think for the most part, um, a lot of the newer architecture that's being built is very much a cut and paste from other parts of the world, and certainly not adapted to Indonesian climate or culture in different ways. That's why, I mean, if I ever lived in Indonesia permanently, I'd like to live in a janky house, but that's my own personal taste. Yeah.
Oke, terima kasih Loren dan terima kasih Mas Akmal untuk tanya. There's another question in chat box from Sofipa Iya. What do you think of modernized kebaya? I've seen that kebaya has changed a lot. What do you think, Loren?
Oh, I see the kabaya question. Yes, yes. I think kabaya and I think fashion also is such a wonderful expression of the way in which culture is fluid and changes, right? Because it's a combination of sort of historical precedent, right? It's a combination of, okay, we know this is the basic structure for a kabaya, right? Plus contemporary trends, plus someone's personal likes and dislikes and the way that they want to dress and express themselves, right? So, I mean, I think kabaya I just think it's incredibly beautiful. But I love seeing the many ways in which it's been reinvented, right? Like, I think there's very modest kabaya. There are kabaya that are more sort of contemporary and have very interesting like cuts and things, right? And I think all that stuff speaks to the fact that culture is not stagnant and it changes all the time. But that also doesn't mean that we completely let go of it. So, and I think you would see I would imagine all the students, whatever country you are from, there's probably, you'll probably see certain types of, sort of traditional clothing being adapted and readapted to modern kind of ideas and modern tastes. But one thing I will say that I think is interesting is I do think the the government, not to become the more skeptical anthropologist, right? But I do think, though, that the government endorsement of Kabaya is interesting, right? We recently had Kabaya Day, right? And so I do think it's always interesting when government gets involved in determining or shaping what is sort of seen as appropriate for people to wear, right? Like even batik, right? I love batik, but even batik is something, this idea of batik day and, everyone across the archipelago wearing batik, even if batik is not necessarily, actually local to your island, right? I think that is definitely, that's something that's engineered by sort of the government. So I think with fashion, you have both the side of what is the government's role or sort of officials' role in shaping, what people are wearing. And then also what is the individual creativity and how people are showing that. And I think just the sheer the diversity of so many different ways that people can wear kabaya is really beautiful. But also I was a little, when I heard about Kabaya Day, I was like, what is this about? So, but I love it. I was very happy because I love Kabaya. But yes, I think that's something that, again, an example of how culture is both sometimes a political tool and also it is a personal expression too, and it can be both. I see there's a question. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Mastidi. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. And that's the answer for yeah. Thank you for the question. And there's another question from Dae Jung Yoon. There's the question for Lauren. First, what made you delve into Indonesian culture? Second one is, if culture is flowing, what is the main factor making culture is flowing in diversity?
It's a really good question. I'll just say for the first one, I came to this as an academic, right? As a researcher, I came to working in Indonesia through, how do I say this? Through like a realization of my own ignorance, right? I think when I was in undergrad, what I mean by this, let me explain. When I was in undergrad, S1, right? I studied colonial and post-colonial history. That's what I studied, right? And when I graduated, I thought I knew a thing or two about, I was like, I've been to a good university, I've studied this. And then I read a book about Indonesia, and I realized that that had been completely missing from my studies, right? And this is something that happens in the US. Indonesia is not really a big part of how the United States, like it's not something that is commonly discussed in classrooms in the US, which I think is really absurd, but that's the way it often is. So I became curious because when I don't know something and I realize there's a big gap in my knowledge, that always makes me more curious to try to fix that gap and educate myself, right? So I became very interested and I read some more, and then I visited once in person as I was starting my PhD. And I just felt on both an intellectual and personal level, I really liked it. I felt I could be myself in Indonesia. I felt that yes, I came from a very different culture, but I also felt like there were aspects of my personality and my values that really fit well with the place in which I found myself. And I think it's important, if any of you are interested in going into a career in academia, and if you want to study a different country, a different culture, pick a place or think about also your own personal, just not just what is intellectually interesting, but what you personally value, right? Because you're going to spend a lot of your life in that place if you decide to make that a big part of your career. And I just really immediately felt very comfortable, right? Which was very strange because I had never been to Indonesia before. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And so then it just kind of continued from there. And the more you learn, of course, the more you realize how much you don't know. So there is always more to learn, right? So then that is one of the reasons why I keep going. And then this question about culture is flowing and why does it I think part of this, why is Indonesia still so diverse? I just think the historical part of it is the geography. It's a massive country, right? And it's so sort of dispersed, right, in different ways. I think that, but I think it's also because Sukarno and the early nationalists set a precedent. They set a precedent that said, you don't all have to be the same to be Indonesian, right? So that's never been, whereas in other countries, that wasn't always the case. In other countries, there was a set idea of, okay, to be this, to be part of this country, you must be this way. You must have this religion, or you must be this, have these customs. And from the very beginning of Indonesians thinking about the nation back in the 1910s and 20s, even before colonialism ended, they always thought of it as diverse in some way, right? Like they disagreed about what that diversity should look like. They disagreed about how it might be governed, right? People had different ideas about what the nation should be. But fundamentally, I don't think there was ever a suggestion that we should all be the same, right? So that's been I think, built into the concept of Indonesia from the very beginning is the ability to and the importance of diversity. So I think that is something that's not just, you know, it's not just a slogan. I think it is something that people really believe firmly. And maybe not everybody, but I think a majority of people still feel very strongly about. And I think that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been this kind of like homogenization that sometimes nationalism can make everyone feel like they have to be a certain way, right? And I think that hasn't happened as much in Indonesia as it might have happened in other places.
Hello. And maybe it's the last question for today's session from, actually, it is one of our lecture at Pandora Hadi. So this question is, first, at which point can we say that our day-to-day way of life has become part of culture? And second one, talking about fashion, some people are concerned that Indonesia will lose diversity with more women wearing hijab. What is Lauren comment?
Yeah, I would say that for the first question, that's a great question. And I actually think that, you know, this idea that we label something as culture is, I mean, this is maybe beyond the scope of this class, but that's actually a relatively recent idea in the history of the world, right? Like for most of the history of the world, people are doing their thing, right? And they're not labeling it as, oh, this is my culture, right? People are going through their life, they're going through their, you know, they're participating in their religion, they're participating in their communities, they're participating in their rituals and in their everyday practices. And then some people have argued that it doesn't happen until the 19th century with globalization, capitalism, and sort of the Industrial Revolution that people start thinking and labeling that stuff as culture, right? Because one of the things that I think is important to remember is that we often don't label something as culture or as heritage until we feel it's under threat, right? Or until we feel it's slipping away from us, right? So this is something I talk a lot about in heritage studies, which is another field that I've worked in the past, is that, you know, when something is under threat, then all of a sudden we call it heritage. Oh, we must protect it, right? Because the world is changing too much. We must protect these janky buildings, right, before they're gone. And I think culture's a little bit like that too. It's, you know, as soon as we feel that something is changing too much, that we're becoming, you know, disconnected from our culture, then we start to label it as culture, right? So I think that, you know, that there are a lot of what we consider culture would not have been labeled as such 200 years ago. It would just be like, this is life. This is what we do, right? And then this question about fashion and this concern that, you know, that Indonesia will lose its diversity with more women wearing hijab. You know, my comment on that, I'm not an expert in this. This isn't my field of study, but my comment on that would just be that I think that people who fear that fundamentally misunderstand what wearing hijab means to some Muslim women, right? And it means different things to everyone, right? And I think some people see that and they think to wear that is to somehow lose your culture or to somehow say, you know, separate yourself from it and adopt something else. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what that means, right? I think that women who choose to wear hijab, that just, you know, that is a statement of that's a personal choice and a statement of their relationship to their faith, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean anything about, losing their other forms of identity that they have, right? Their other connections to history and other, other kinds of cultural and community connections, right? So I think a lot of the concern about that, I think, is a little bit of a panic that shouldn't that is not actually looking at the reality of the fact that hijab is a choice that expresses one's relationship to faith at that moment in time, and that it doesn't negate anything else, right? It doesn't make you any less Indonesian or any less whatever your culture is. And so I think that the concern about that is misplaced. And I think it's not really understanding. And I don't think it gives credit to, the fact that women are complex and it can have multiple identities and multiple ways and are not defined by the choice, like by a single choice that they might make. Right. So that's my comment on that, not being an expert.
Okay, thank you, Lauren, for the answer. And thank you for all the questions from the participants. Maybe this is our last session for today. Thank you again for Lauren Yap for today's session. That's a fascinating session. It's add new knowledge for me or for us, for the all participants. Thank you very much. And then
Thank you all. Terima kasih banyak.
think that we then move to our MC today for closing session. Please, Mas Akmal and Mbak Kori, silahkan.
Okay, thank you very much, Mas Didit, for being the excellent moderator for today's session, and thank you so much, Lauren Yap, PhD, for the excellent speakers today. Unfortunately, our time is up. Let's give a round of applause for our moderator and the speakers. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Didit and Lauren Yap. Okay, guys, we have distributed the attendance list for the season. If you have not marked down your attendance, please do so.
Okay, everyone, we have on the last session for today. So tomorrow we still have session with Prof. Kong Yong Hoon, PhD from Hanku University of Forest Studies. So I want to make sure for all of you, the participants, to join before 3 Jakarta times tomorrow to avoid the Zoom admissions to make it not crowded. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for your attending today, guys. See you tomorrow. Stay healthy, stay happy, and bye-bye. See you.
Terima kasih banyak, Lauren.
Oh, terima kasih banyak sekali. Itu sangat menyenangkan ya. Semoga berguna.
Semoga sangat berguna. Semoga tahun depan bisa secara offline ya.
Oh, I would love that. Bagus sekali ya. Kalau Zoom selalu gak susah ya. Jadi saya senang sekali. Nanti ya kalau ada kesempatan untuk melakukan ini diskusi secara in person, ya bagus banget.
Terima kasih banyak untuk
Ya, terima
kesempatannya.
kasih banyak sekali ya. Sampai nanti ya.
Ya.